Sorry, I'm a little late getting started. My son had an issue. He needs some help with something, so my wife is helping him now. Yeah, he's having a toothache, which is kind of weird for a 7-year-old. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but anyway, streaming today. Yesterday I streamed. I talked about HTML a lot, and my plan was to cover HTML and CSS yesterday, but HTML took a while, so I'm going to talk about CSS today. There's a lot to cover with CSS, and there could be a lot. I mean, you could take an entire semester-long course on web design focusing on HTML and CSS. You'd usually call that something like web development or front-end development now. So I'm going to try to cover as much as I can in some time today. I'll keep it under an hour, but that's, there's a lot I want to make sure that you have available to you. And like I keep saying with this, my main goal is that you all get access to and get some experience working with HTML and CSS, and you get that experience and that exposure a couple different ways: Codecademy, W3 Schools, and me. But ultimately, the real learning, the way that it's going to actually make sense to you the most, is when you try it out yourself and when you try to make it work for your project. So that's hopefully the stage you're at right now. And I'll talk about that and take you through that in a moment. Let me just see who's online, or how many people are online. I was trying a different way of looking at the stream over here on my other computer, but I didn't like the way it looked, so I'm going to go back to my normal way of doing it. Hope you all are doing okay. It's a sunny afternoon right now. Clouds have been coming and going. And hello, yeah, thank you for saying hi already without me even prompting. So good to see you all. Good to see you all. Good to see that you were watching. I can't actually see you, but you know what I mean. So I believe UMW domains and everything else, like Banner and Canvas, I believe that's all still inaccessible. So I do have another way I can show you some stuff. So I'm going to be okay as far as being able to do that, but it is a little bit inconvenient. So yeah, I don't know. The latest from IT is that they think they found the problem and are working on it. So that's the last tweet I saw from the IT people. So hopefully that will get resolved soon. Obviously we need access to Canvas and Banner to do things. So, otherwise we just have to wait. But we can still do things while we wait. So let me switch over to my two screens, and over here on the left, this is the difference I have today is that I'm going to be working on things on my computer and then uploading them to the website in the background. It's a slightly different workflow. It's a bit more work to set up, but it's just as easy to work with once you do get it set up. I still recommend using the file manager and the code editor when you can. So today you probably won't be able to do that in real time with me. So take notes as I talk about this, and then go back later and look at this in the archive if you need to. I'm not going to show you how to set up the system I have here today just because it's several steps, and you probably don't actually, you probably need admin permission to get the kind of privileges that I needed in order to set this up. So that can be done, but it takes, again, several steps. So bear with me as I try to explain and talk through things. By the way, actually, let me go ahead and hide that. I don't need that thing up there. Whenever you're trying to figure out if a website is up or down, sometimes I like to share, practical things that are part of the web. There's a useful little site. It's isup.me or downforeveryone or justme.com. There's two different versions of it. And this is a way to find out if a particular website is down or if it's just something on your end that prevents you from accessing it. This can be a really convenient, thing to do. You may not know the domain in question, but the problem right now that we're dealing with at UMW is that this domain is down. And so we can see that, just checking it, running it through here, in fact, it is still down. And we can see that without having to go to it and then wait for it to time out. This site here has already pre-checked that for us, and it can tell us that it's down. This can be useful if you're working on your own website and you can't get to it, for example. You might want to find out, is it something wrong with my website, or is it something I'm doing wrong? And then you can kind of help troubleshoot it from there. So if the site is up but you can't access it, that's when you should try a different browser or a different computer or something like that. But in this case, auth.umw.edu is just down and nothing we can do about it. We just have to wait. So this is, as you can see on the left here, this is my agenda for today. So I wanted to talk about each of these points here and tell you what I'm going to try to cover in the next hour or so, or hopefully less, but we'll see. I'm going to talk about how to set up for CSS, and that's how to set up the basic workflow of this. I did that a little bit at the end of the stream yesterday, but I'll start with that again. And that's going to be using a link element and a style.css file. I like doing CSS in a separate file because it's a separate language from HTML. They're built on top of each other, but they are separate languages. They have their own syntax, their own purposes. So I like to keep them separate as separate files. The nice thing too about having it as a separate file is in this case, we're just doing one page, but in a normal real-world web development environment, you're probably going to be doing dozens or hundreds of pages. And the great thing about a style sheet is that you can create a style sheet once and then use that same style sheet over and over again for all 600 of your web pages, if that's what you have. And then if you get that done and then you realize, oh wait, I actually have the wrong background color, you just have to change that one style sheet and then all 600 web pages get a new background color. So that's the real beauty of and real power of CSS, I think. So I like to work with it this way, even in this case where you just have one file, just because, again, that's the normal, or that's the, I guess, way of doing things. There are other ways, like you can do CSS inside the head and you can do CSS inline as an attribute on an element, but those are kind of like quick fixes kind of things, sort of like a band-aid sort of approach. It's better to do it from the outset in separate file, I think, anyway. Okay, so that's what I'm going to cover. The next thing I will cover is CSS syntax. I'll talk a little bit about how to write CSS, and that is going to include these three concepts of selectors, properties, and values. I'll talk about those, and then once we've got the basic foundations for CSS, I'll talk about color, how to specify colors with CSS, how to do things with typography, including serifs and sans serif fonts. So this is what we're talking about with typography. There's several classifications of fonts, but generally serif versus sans serif are the main things we're going to try to talk about. Finally, next, layout. That's something else that you can and probably should be doing with CSS as opposed to HTML. And then finally, just kind of what should you actually do? Like, given the ability to change the typeface, what should you change it to? And given the ability to affect the layout, what is a good layout? I'm going to try to talk about some of those things near the end. But if you want to go ahead and take a look and think about that, what I like to do whenever I'm designing a new site is like literally take a pencil and paper and sort of scribble out a tiny version of it, a thumbnail version of it, maybe a few different versions of it. Or if I have a whiteboard, I like to use the dry erase markers and kind of draw out what I kind of want it to look like. And that gives me a roadmap for what to follow once I start trying to write my CSS. So then I'm writing my CSS towards a specific goal. So I recommend doing that, maybe even now. Come up with just your basic idea of what you want this web page to look like. It doesn't have to be fancy, as I showed you yesterday, but just think about what do you want to do. This example I have here is not great. It's just black text on a white background. Like, there's a lot more I would hope you can do than what we have here. So we'll talk about that, and I'll show you some examples. Okay, so I do have Slack open if you have questions as I go, but you probably, like I said, don't have access to your file manager right now, so you probably can't follow along and try things out. But as you do, always, whenever you do get to try that out, always feel free to send me questions, and I'll try to answer as quickly as I can. Okay, so hold on a second. Just remember, I need to plug in my phone here. So let's get started. There are two files in question here. I have this HTML file, which you saw yesterday. I'm using a tool called Sublime Text to edit this, and Sublime Text is a code editor. It's much more robust than the code editor that you can access through the web interface of your file manager in cPanel. But it's basically does the same thing where you type things and then the colors change depending on the syntax of what you're writing and what language you're writing in. And right now I'm writing in HTML, so it just looks a little different than what it did on the web. It's got a dark background. It's got the tags are in this kind of reddish purple color. Attributes are this greenish color. Values are going to be this yellow color. So it's just a different color schema, but basically the same thing. One of my favorite things about, I have two really things I really like about Sublime Text. Actually, maybe three, but one of the things I really like is once you get a really long document, I don't know how well you can see it, but here on the right side of the document view, you've got sort of a miniature picture of the document. And sometimes, especially when you're writing a lot of code, you kind of forget where you were last and where to jump into, and you can kind of see a thumbnail view of your whole document here, and you can slide up and down in that if you kind of remember what the code you were writing looked like. I use that all the time. I find it really useful. Something else that's kind of fun is if, let's say, you have to change a bunch of things at once. You can hold, you can click and then hold Control and then keep clicking, and you can multiply your cursor, and then you've got all of these cursors, and I'm typing in multiple rows at once. Not always that useful practically, but I think kind of neat. And then finally, you've got a really powerful find and replace thing built into Sublime Text. It uses regular expressions, which is a commonly used language for doing really complex find and replace substitutions, and you can do it across a whole bunch of files at once or just the one file you're working on. Regex is a very it's a very powerful tool. It's also very opaque. Like it's really hard to look at a regular expression and understand what it's doing without a lot of practice. And it's something I've been doing for years, but I still find very challenging. But it's all built into Sublime Text when you need it, which is great. Okay, so let's talk about the style sheet. Like I said, I made I have two documents. This is my HTML that I wrote the other day, and then I've linked it to this style.css document, which is a separate document. So I'm going to go ahead and open that one here in a new Sublime Text tab. And here it is. It's an empty document still. There's nothing in it. What I've got set up here, by the way, will, whenever I hit save, let me show you this. If I type the word hello, if I Control S to save this document, and then refresh it here, it uploads here. So this file is actually on my computer. It's just I've set it up so whenever I save it, it automatically uploads it to my web server, so you can see it live on the same same place I was showing it to you yesterday. It's a very convenient way to have things set up. So let's take a look at the style CSS. So the name of this file does not matter as long as it really should end in CSS, but the name of it doesn't end. The name of it doesn't matter. I just like to call it style, or sometimes styles, or style sheet. It really doesn't matter as long as you call it the same thing here. Because remember, names aren't just how a file knows itself. It's actually a path. It's like directions for finding and loading that file. So if I typed this wrong here, even if I typed it like capital S, this HTML document might not know where to find the style sheet, and then it might not load correctly when I view it in a web browser. So those are things to check. I mean, when you set this up for the first time and something's not working, that's usually the first thing to check, is to make sure that you are linking the correct style sheet and that it actually is working. That's the kind of thing that I'm happy to help you troubleshoot, but that's usually the first thing I check if that's a question. Okay, so let's talk about CSS. CSS is built on HTML. But it's an abstraction. It's like an abstract layer above and beyond HTML. HTML is focused on content and structure, and CSS is focused on presentation or design, or how it looks. And so we want to, we have to write it differently. In any kind of computing context, syntax is just the rules for how you write something, and CSS has its own set of rules. I'm going to write a basic expression here, and this is not a real one. This is just a template. So the template goes like this. It's a selector. I'll give you some specific examples in a second. This is just the template. And then each selector is followed by a pair of curly brackets. I like to do them like that, with one at the end of the selector and then one several lines down. And then in here we write a series of property value pairs. And notice a couple things about how I wrote these. Now these aren't actually showing up in color because they aren't real, but if they were real, then Sublime would recognize them and give them proper color coding. So the selector goes here, it goes outside of the curly brackets, so the curly brackets open and then close. And then within this we have the property, which has a name, and then it has a colon, and then whatever value that property expects, and then a semicolon. And so this is the, over and over and over again, this is the thing that you should be doing. You don't actually have to put them on separate lines, as long as you keep those semicolons there, but I think it's a lot easier to read this way. So that's how I like to do it. If you're having problems with CSS, this is the second thing I usually check for, is to look for syntax errors in your CSS. A common one is if you forget the semicolon, it will, this style will probably work, this property will probably work, but this one probably, the next one probably won't, the one on line 4, because it is like confused. It thinks it's a continuation of the one that came before it. So you want to make sure you have that semicolon at the end of each line, and that'll keep things nice and straight. Okay, so again, this is the template. This is not an actual CSS expression or declaration, but it's what it should look like. So the selector is, as the name suggests, selecting which part of the HTML document we want to assign a property value to. And the easiest way to understand that is that in HTML we have tags like body, head, image, H1, H2, P, strong. And the most common kind of selector you'll see is simply to name the tag that you want to change. So let's try changing, let's just do a simple one. Let's do P. So this, I just typed the letter P. I don't do no angle brackets or anything like that. It's just the letter P. And this should select every instance of a P element in my HTML document. So all of these Ps are going to be selected by this selector here, which is just the letter P. So let's try a really simple change. I like to do really ugly changes when I'm just testing things, just to make sure that I notice the difference. And I recommend that as well. So let's try changing the color. Let's make it purple. And I'll talk about actual like colors in a second, but just for now, I'll just do the word purple. The name of that property is color, and the value that I've assigned it is the word purple. Notice I've got a colon, I've got a semicolon, and you see this, hopefully you can see the color changed because it recognized the correct syntax. So let's see if that changes. And it did, great. So if you notice a couple things, every paragraph now is purple, but other things are not, like the headings. I did that on purpose because I wanted you to see that this only applies to the things that are included in the selector. So the selector here, P, that includes just the paragraphs, and those are changed. It also includes everything within the paragraph. Remember how within the first paragraph I added some inline tags for strong and EM and code. Those inherit their color from their parent. So their parent is P, and so they inherit that color, and then they go from there. That idea of inheritance, that's what the C in cascading style, C in CSS is about. So I'll just write it here. CSS equals cascading style sheet. And the cascade refers to that idea of inheritance. So that's what's happening there. Okay, so in a face-to-face class, this would be a place where I would pause and make sure everyone's okay with what I'm doing, or that if they're following along, they're doing that, and they've successfully changed the color of their page. Again, you probably can't, so I'm just going to move on, but if there's any part of what I just did that was confusing and you want to ask for clarification, you can do that now if you'd like. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. Let's see what the next thing was that I had in my notes. Yeah, okay, so that's the syntax, selectors, properties, values. The values depend on the property. So the kinds of things that are available for the value depends on the property. So if you're setting any kind of dimensional property like width or height, then those are going to need pixel values or relative values or other size unit values. For color, which is, I guess, the next thing on my list, there's 2 or 3 ways to do it. The easiest way, especially when you're just trying things out, is just to name a color. And there's something like 120 color keywords that CSS will recognize. Really, it's not CSS recognizing it, it's the web browser, but you can try things like gray. This is not going to look good, but again, we don't want things to look good yet necessarily. Or we've got, sometimes you can just try it out and see what happens. Let's see if light green is that one. Maybe. Oh, it is. Wow. Okay, I was guessing. There's a lot of these, and sometimes you can just get it right, but that doesn't give you much control. So if you are really being thoughtful about your design, you probably want to fine-tune these numbers a little bit, or these colors a little bit. And you can do this with there's two pretty common ways to change the color. That's with either using RGB notation or hex notation. So let me do, actually I'll leave all of these here. I'm going to go back to purple. And I'm going to make a new line. I'm going to say, I'm going to comment this one out, and that's going to be /* This is a way for me to keep that code there, but disable it so I can't see it. Let me show you that again, by the way, because that's really useful. There's actually a shortcut in Sublime Text and also a lot of other code editors. If you do Control /, it'll comment out whatever line you're on. So that's what's, that's what I'm doing there. Color purple. It's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. We'll leave it off. And I'll try to make purple a different way. All right, so right now we're back to the default, which is just black. So let's try to change it a different way. Color can be indicated in a few different ways. What is that? I don't know that one. Okay, sorry, there's different, sometimes CSS develops new things. But okay, so RGB is another way to do it, and this one's pretty intuitive. It just takes some practice to get used to it. For RGB, RGB stands for red, green, blue, and RGB colors expect 3 numbers. So it's going to expect one here, and one here. And these numbers, they can be given as percentages if you have a hard time thinking of it otherwise. But really what they're doing is this is a number that's between 0 to mean 0 or 255 to mean 100%. These go from 0 to 255. So all zeros is going to be black. All 255s is going to be white. So this is actually going to be white, and it's going to make the text appear invisible. It's still there, but it's invisible. But to mix any color, you just have to decide how much red, how much green, how much blue do you want to mix into your palette of colors. This is light mixing, so the more you add, the lighter it gets. If that makes sense. The lower it is, the more saturated it is, or the more difference between the numbers, the more saturated it is. It takes some trial and error, basically. And there's some websites you can look up different color palettes, and if you find a group of colors that look nice together, those websites usually will give you the RGB notation for it, or sometimes the Hex notation, which I'll show you next. But this is, let's see, we're trying to do purple, right? So we want all red. Let's see, we want no green and all blue, right? So let's try this and see how that looks. Okay, so that's purple. It's a different purple, so it's like a pinkier purple, but kind of nice. Let's see what happens if we lower these down a bit. This might be too dark, but we'll try it. Yeah, that's too dark. So let's go back up a bit. And you notice I'm just leaving the green at 0, and then I'm just changing the red and the blue colors. So that's about where we were before. Yeah, it's purplish. I'm not sure exactly what the purple equivalence is in RGB in terms of the keyword, but that's still pretty good. Okay, so that's the second way to do color. The third way, let's try this other way. Again, I'm using the comments to keep that code there. Let's do it with hex notation. So hex notation is the hardest to read, but once you've done it a little bit, you can start to remember a couple of patterns. So a hex notation is going to be a hash mark like that, followed by 6 numbers or letters. Hex notation that's short for hexadecimal. And so each of these digits that you see here in a hex declaration is not a 0 on the decimal scale, it's a 0 on the hexadecimal scale. What that means is in a decimal scale, we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 20. We add it at units of 10. We reset the digit every 10 steps. In hexadecimal, we reset the digit every 16 steps. This allows us to get a lot more values in less space. That's the history of this kind of notation back when space was much more expensive on computers. So hexadecimal goes, instead of starting over again after 9, it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. It's hard to get your head around. I can't do, some people can look at hexadecimal and do calculations in their head. I cannot. But the values here are, 0 is always 0 for whatever your notation system is. But for this kind of context, F is the highest. So 6 Fs is going to be all white. 6 Fs is equivalent to 3 255s in the RGB notation. So let's see how that looks. Yeah, so we're back to white. So if we wanted to change this back to purple, like we were doing, we should do something similar. Let's take the green all the way down, and see how that looks. I didn't explain this yet, but the first 2 digits here are your red, the second 2 are your green, and the last 2 are the blue. So it follows the same pattern as the RGB. It's just expressing those values differently using the hexadecimal thing. A lot of times you will see, like if you look at a color website, like colorlovers.com is one that gives you palettes. Most of the time they're going to just give you hexadecimal. And it's easy to copy and paste those. You can also use a color picker. There's a lot of ways you can figure out a color, and a lot of times they'll use hexadecimal because it's the most abbreviated way to express a color. So this is still, let's see, it's still a little bit too, let's go down a bit. Oops. The fun thing about hexadecimal numbers too is that they actually spell words. So you can, yeah, that doesn't look very good. You can, like this one sort of spells the word dead. So sometimes people have fun with that, but it doesn't really add any meaning to it. So 3 different ways to indicate color. Now you don't want to go crazy with color. You want to be, careful about it, but it's something to think a little bit about. When I get down to talking about design, contrast is an important aspect of design, but you don't want to be too harsh in terms of your contrast. Contrast is good for clarity, but I like to take it sort of a step in. Like I like to say, instead of like all black, all white, think of like dark gray and very, very light gray. And so it's not a full contrast, it's a little step in. And I think that works better for a lot of people. It's a little bit more comfortable to read. So let's try this with, hello? Okay, it's okay. I don't. So let's try. What are you doing? Okay. Okay. So let's go back to notes and let's actually talk about type. Let's stay on color a little bit. So what I just did, I changed color, and I usually do this in the opposite way, but what I did just now, I changed the color for just the text of the paragraphs. One thing that sometimes trips people up is I think I want to change the text color, so maybe the property should be text-color. That's actually incorrect, and you can see the syntax highlighting is warning me that that's not right. Like it didn't color code it correctly. So text color is actually not what it's called. It's just color. The other way, the other type of color, the other place where you're going to be changing the color is in the background. So let's try a slightly different way of doing this with a new selector. I know I'm moving quickly, by the way, but since you all are hopefully just taking notes and not trying to follow along, hopefully I'm not getting ahead of you because you're just following along. But again, let me know if you have any questions. Okay, so when I use this as the selector, the P, it selected every paragraph. But let's say I want to change the whole document all at once. I don't want to have to just do the paragraphs and then maybe do the headings separately. I want to change everything to the same color. And actually, that's probably a good idea to change everything that way. We can do that, and we just have to say color. But let's try a confusing example. Let's try changing it to green. This should be pretty ugly. But notice what changes when I do that. Hopefully you can see the colors, but the headings here are green and the text, the paragraphs are purple. The purple declaration overruled the green declaration because body is the parent and everything inherits the parent's colors unless something else says otherwise, and I have the P selector here saying otherwise, and that's a more specific selector than the body, so that's why it overrules it. But again, I really do think it makes more sense to have everything the same color in terms of text. Use color to make different kinds of things look different, like a link. A link is a different kind of text, and you definitely want the links to stand out. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's what's happening here when you see this on this phrase, blanditis accusantium, that you definitely want your links to be very clearly different than everything around it. But actually, I don't actually like green text on a white background. But again, the point is to show you that this is how it works. The other place where you're going to change color is in the background. So background color is the way to do this. As you can see, hopefully with the autocomplete, that you have other kinds of things you can assign to the background, like an image. But I think a color is usually better. So let's try something that will look terrible. Make the background black. Might not be terrible, but yeah, that's pretty bad. So this is, yeah, hopefully you can see it. On the right here now, the background is black and the text is green. Green text on a black background is pretty hard on the eyes. I don't recommend that. In general, I don't recommend a dark background, but it does sometimes work if you add enough contrast. But notice how this is different. So color is going to be the text, and background color is the background color, as the name indicates. It's just a little confusing because you would expect color to be foreground color or text color or something like that. In terms of a good balance between those two, like I said, I prefer kind of not entirely black and white, but maybe a little bit in and maybe a little bit of tone to one or either of those. So let's try to actually come up with something that looks kind of okay. Let's make the color a dark gray and make the background color a very light white. I mean, you know, not quite white. And that's pretty good. I think the background is still too dark. So I'm gonna go with ease on that. That's still too dark. Yeah, let's try that. Yeah, I'll take it. That'll work. And the text, I can probably make the text a little lighter. But you know, trial and error sometimes will get you what you need. And this is okay. I'm not thrilled with that, but it's workable. Okay, so those are the two places you're going to be changing the color. All right, let's see what else. Let's talk about typography. So typography is, you know, the way the letters and numbers look. And the main thing that you want to think about with typography is the font that you're using, or the typeface. To be really pedantic about it, a font is software that renders a typeface. So sometimes when people talk about a font, they actually mean typeface. Like Comic Sans is a typeface, but Comic Sans MS is a font that renders the typeface Comic Sans. Anyway, the point is, the two very broad categories for fonts, serif and sans serif. What I think people still struggle with sometimes with fonts is that my web browser here, my Firefox on the right, it only has access to the fonts on my computer, and so whenever I tell it a font to use, I can say in a style sheet, use XY font, but it can only do that if it actually has access to that font software, which it may not. There is a way to embed fonts from the web, but I like to, and I can show you that if you really want to, but I like to do this, I like to do things the more old-fashioned way, which is to use web-safe fonts. In other words, use fonts that you can be very confident everyone will have on their computer. And that includes those standards like Times New Roman and Helvetica and Arial and Verdana and Comic Sans, not as much, but you know, very conservative choices basically. I like to keep fonts pretty straightforward most of the time. So let's do a couple things here with fonts. In terms of readability, I find that a serif font works better for text that's inline like this, like a paragraph, whereas sans serif font looks stronger, looks better when it's in a heading like that. So we can actually change the headings and the paragraphs in separate declarations in CSS to set it up that way. So I'm going to keep the paragraph the way it is, but I want to make a new declaration. I'm going to put it here to change the H1 to a different font. So remember, H1 is the title, Black Lives Matter protest in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to a different font. And the way you set up a font explanation or expression is by creating what's called a font family. And what you're saying is you're giving the browser several choices. You give it a first choice, and then if it doesn't have that file, go to a second choice. If it doesn't have that one, go to a third, and so on. So you're giving it a cascading series of options. So let's start with Helvetica. If you don't have Helvetica, go to Arial. If you don't have that, go to Droid Sans. If you don't have that, just go to whatever sans serif font you have. The browser will be configured, like is set up with automatically with the default sans serif font, so we can have it do that just as a fallback. Okay, pretty sure I do not have any of these fonts on this particular computer, but let's see. Okay, so there it is. I don't actually recognize that font. I don't believe it's, well, let's see, what is that? I don't believe it's Helvetica or Arial. It might be Droid Sans. These are all going to be very similar fonts that most people won't bother to notice the difference between, but if you get really picky about it, Helvetica is, I think, superior aesthetically to Arial, but most of the time you can use them interchangeably. But I think, yeah, I don't seem to have, maybe that is just the default sans serif. Anyway, you can see the difference here, hopefully. In a serif font, you have little feet on the end of things. So, like, let me zoom way in here. So if you look at, I don't know, lowercase a in this font here, you can see that the A has a little foot that keeps going at the end of it, whereas in the sans serif, it does have that too. Okay, that's not a good example. But look at the N. Okay, so the N, that definitely has like a hat and then 2 feet on each of those legs. Not the case for the sans serif font. The serif is that little bit there. And so you want to have a, you want it to be a title, I think, especially you want to have it a cleaner look, and that's easier to read there. Whereas the serif helps you kind of string things together along a line. Okay, so that changed one of those headings, but I have several other layers of headings. I have H1, I have H2, I have H3s as well. I want to make sure that my typography indicates that these are all the same kind of thing. These are all headings as opposed to text. And so I want to actually make all of these sans serif. One of the great things about CSS is that you can combine selectors. So in the selector space of this particular declaration, if I add a comma, I can add another another selector, and then another selector. H1, H2, H3, I'll go ahead and add H4. These are all now selectors that are going to be applying this declaration, this property font family, and should work all the way down the page. So I think that looks pretty good. That's what I would recommend doing in your case also, having a serif for your text and then a sans serif for the headings. I think that looks better. Hopefully you agree. Okay, so there's a whole lot else we could go into with fonts. Let me I will show you the other way of doing fonts, just in case you want to do something a little fancier. Google is probably the most popular proprietor of these so-called web fonts, and you can get really carried away with this, to be honest. Like, I think that's the one drawback, is that you can get really into these and you can get carried away, and you can do something that's unnecessarily complicated looking. But let's take a look at this one. Okay, fine. So this one's called Balsamic Sans. It looks kind of like Comic Sans, but better than Comic Sans, I think. I don't like Comic Sans, especially the capital C, and so I think this is a much more balanced font, but still a nice like handwriting font. So this is a good font. I like this font. So if we want to use it, we have to, where is the code? How do I do this? I have it, my window is too small to see everything I need to. I'll make this a little bigger. I don't want to download it. Maybe no, I don't want to download it. How do I do it? Okay, yeah. So you have to go to, okay, I see what it is. You have to go to Select Styles, and we just want the regular weight. Yeah, let's do regular and bold. And then we want to embed these fonts. So let me see if I can make sure you can see this part of the window. This is all built into Google, so this is their proprietary system of doing this, and my head's kind of in the way, so let me just lean back for a second. So I selected which styles of this font, which parts of it I wanted, and then I had it generate the embed code, and it's given me the code I need to use. It's given me a link that I can use in my HTML document, or an import statement I can use in CSS, and then it gave me the font family declaration to use as well. So I can just copy this actually. So I'm writing in a CSS context already, so I'm just going to copy this part of it where it says @import URL blah blah blah, and copy it over here into this. And yeah, you can't see that. Let me change my wrap settings on here. So yeah, this is just one line, but it just wraps it around, right? And you know, this is pulling this directly from Google, but you don't have to really know what that means other than that. But notice one thing, I didn't copy the style tags from their embed code because I'm not writing in HTML right now, I'm writing in CSS. If I wanted to put that directly in the HTML document, I would need the style tags around it. Any one of those three methods will accomplish the same thing. It loads this remote font file. So then this is the font family way of using it. So I'll comment out what I wrote before and put this in here. This is Balsamic Sans. So let's see how that looks. It looks pretty good. Now fonts do have a kind of meaning to them, and so you need to be thoughtful about what kind of tone does your font convey. To me, this font has a very friendly look to it, and it's the kind of thing that I would probably write on use to write on the whiteboard of my my OBS screen. It looks like handwriting. It looks a little casual. It looks to me a little bit incongruous with this image of something on fire. It looks a little harsh, like there's some dissonance here in the design. So I don't recommend this font for a really serious topic. It's not quite as bad as Comic Sans in looking trivial, but it's moving that way. So I would recommend not using it for a pretty serious topic. But if it's something more friendly or more casual or informal, then I think it could be a great choice actually. That whole process there, these are free fonts you can use. You can also, what's the other one? Typekit is another website you can do this from with a similar workflow. You find a font you like, and then you can embed it. You just have to follow their directions. You really don't have to, and ultimately, I do recommend using the web-safe fonts most of the time because they're safer. Okay, so let me talk about layout, and let me see, how's my time? Yeah, I got time. I have time to do a layout. So I'm actually going to change a little bit in my OBS view so you can see the problem that this web page currently has in layout. So layout has to do with how things are organized. Let me see if I can do it this way. I don't know if you can see this, but this is very, very, there it is. Let me move myself back up. There I am. So this web page is very, very wide. Like the text is just going to flow completely from the left side all the way to the right side. And that's not what we want. It's hard to read, and if you think about how your eyes move left and right, you want to keep your eyes in a more comfortable reading position, a more comfortable reading space. You want to kind of move your eyes in the middle, not all the way left and right. So one thing that a lot of people like to do is move all of the text into a central column or maybe a slightly left-oriented column of text. That's usually what you see in most web layouts. Think about how most newspaper articles are laid out on the web. They have some margin on the left and right side to give them some cushion, to give them some room. And otherwise you feel a little boxed in, you feel compressed. So we want to use negative space margins on the sides to help us feel a little bit more comfortable with the reading distance here. So I'm going to actually have to switch back and forth a bit. So I'm going to keep this nice and wide view of it, and I'll show you how I'm going to hopefully improve this. So this, I'll scroll up to get my image in view. So let's see. Now this is, to go back to CSS, let me put the CSS back on top for a second. For CSS, a couple of things you have to do to make this happen. We need to add a little bit of structure back into our HTML, and then we can use that structure to change the overall size of the thing we're doing. So there is in HTML5, which is what the current standard is for HTML, there are quite a few what are called semantic tags, meaning they are named after the thing that you are trying to do with it. In olden times, whenever we wanted to make a block of our web layout, an article, what you would very frequently do is something like this. You'd say div id equals article, and then you type it correctly, and then you would make that whole thing a div, and then you would put that in there, and then at the end, and then maybe at the top, you'd have a div id equals navigation, and and then you'd have all of your navigation links, and so everything would be divs with different IDs. So HTML5 comes along and says, why don't we just make a tag called article? Like if we're all doing div ID article, why not just make one thing instead of having to do all that typing? So now you can do article and nav for navigation and a bunch of other things. It's great. So article is a block tag just like body. I'm going to put this at the very beginning. I'm going to open it at the very beginning, right after body opens, and I'm going to close it right after the last part of my text. So I'm going to even give it a little bit of cushion there. And this is, yeah, so this is it. This will let me select this as a group. This lets me talk about the whole content in one expression in CSS. So let me go over here and do that. So if you remember, body is everything so far. Article is also everything, but article is inside of body, which is important because that's going to let us create it as a single, a central column. So let's do a little bit of layout trickery. I'm not going to explain the whole reason why this works. I'm just going to give this to you. It's actually a little trick, but it's not too tricky. It's just, it is what it is. You can actually, there's a lot of, I didn't know you could do widows. Okay, anyway, so this is the whole thing with Sublime. It suggests things you didn't realize you could do. So first of all, let's decide how wide we want the column to be. You can do percentages. I like percentages. Let's just, for demo purposes, let's just do 60%. So when you say width equals 60%, that's going to be 60% of whatever its parent is. In this case, the body is everything, and so that's going to be 100% of the width. It's going to be 100% of the window unless you say otherwise. So we'll say 100%, and then the article is now going to be 60% of that 100%. So it's going to be a little over half of that width. And we're going to add this line here, which will do a little bit of counterintuitive magic to actually put that in the center. We're going to set the top margin. This sets the top margin and the bottom margin to 0. And then the auto here, that's the magic part. The magic part is saying calculate an automatic value for the left and the right margins. And it just takes whatever it has left over and divides that in half. And so then you end up with half of the space there and half of the space there. And it looks like it's in the middle. So let's see what that looks like. If we put that back on top and refresh this, and it kind of worked. Yeah, there we go. So I say kind of because you see there's something up with the image, but I can fix that in a minute. But you can see the text here is all lined up nicely in the middle, and that's what I was going for. This is a much more comfortable reading width. It's still kind of wide, but I kind of like that. Notice what happens though as you shrink it down, the column in the middle does shrink as well. So if you make this extremely narrow, the text ends up being extremely narrow as well, but still readable and not too bad. If you want to get really fancy, you can do what's called a responsive web layout, where it would actually change those margins and the width of the column relative to the size of the device you're using, like if you have it on your phone, but we don't have to get into that today. So I think this is a reasonable way to do it. And a lot of times phones will just automatically create a responsive version of a website these days. Okay, so that's the width. Now, as I mentioned, the image, it goes off to the side too much, and a couple things we should do with that. One way would be to set the width of it to be the same as the column, to follow the width of the column of text. And the way to do that, I think this will work, is because the image is a child of the column, I think if we just set its width to 100%, it will be 100% of that 60%, and so it'll also be a 60% width. I'm not totally sure that will work, so let's try it. Oh, it did. Okay, great. You notice that change didn't change the height, it just changed the width, but that's pretty good. I kind of like that. We're actually pretty close to the original dimensions for this image. So that's one way to keep that in the column. The other way, and this of course depends on your image, one thing you also might do is maybe you want to have it just actually disappear. Like if it just gets to the edge of the column of text, maybe just have it go away. So let's take off that width thing, get back to the too wide version. And let me kind of move this back here. So here again, it's too wide. But let's say maybe we just want it to cut off. I think this will work here if I do it like this. So going back to the article declaration, if I say, I want to tell it what to do with the overflow. When things go beyond the edges, I'm going to say just hide it. So overflow hidden means once you get to the edge, you start overflowing, just hide whatever else is there. So yeah, so there it cuts it off. So that way the image keeps the dimensions it had before, but the extra that hangs over is just hidden because we don't need it, I guess. So those are the two options, I suppose. There's others, but that should work for that. Okay, so I know I've been moving fast, and that's, again, based on the assumption that you're either taking notes or planning to watch this later and work through it whenever we have access to cPanel again, and you can do this on your own sites. These changes I made to this document so far, these are the kinds of things I'd like to see you doing. I'd like to see you controlling the layout in terms of width. You can do much more fancy things, like in terms of positioning if you want to. But I think at a minimum, I think this is a pretty good thing to shoot for. It's pretty readable. And also changing the typography, changing the fonts, that would be definitely something I expect you to be able to do. The final thing to think about, and I'm just going to talk about these, I'm not going to have time to show you anything, is thinking about what to actually design, like what to actually do. And so these four concepts, I'll just show you how these apply in the layout I have so far. I think that should work. These four concepts, like you can, as you notice, there's an acronym here, and you could arrange these in a different order and spell a different word, C-A-R-P or C-R-A-P. There are other acronyms, though, that are C-R-A-P, so I kind of like C-A-R-P. These things come from Robin Williams, so not the comedian, but Robin Williams, who is a graphic designer, and she has a book, actually it's in several different editions, the Non-Designer's Design Book. And her goal in that book is to try and make the world of graphic design understandable to someone who hasn't had a lot of experience with it. And I think it's very clear. I think it's a great book for getting some foundational concepts and then learning how to apply them. And so what she's talking about is using contrast, using alignment, using repetition, using proximity to control the layout of what you're doing and draw your reader's attention to the things you want them to see about what you've created. So in this case, contrast here is most evident in the text color, foreground and background. That's going to be, that's good. I mean, this is a pretty good amount of contrast. You might go more or less, but that's pretty good. If you do something with colors as opposed to black and white like I have, be mindful that too much contrast between colors, like two bright colors that are opposite to each other, right up against each other, can be very uncomfortable to read. So if you think about like a bright blue background with orange text on it would be extremely difficult to read. You don't want to do that. You want to make it more of a change in hue than anything else. But hopefully this one, contrast is pretty intuitive, right? You want to keep things different. Alignment has to do with layout, and you can see that this is a line on the left. And so as you go visually down the left side of this text, it all lines up on this nice, neat edge. So let me break that and show you what that would look like otherwise. Let's say we had it all aligned center. So this is going to be a bad design. Text aligned center here keeps everything aligned in the center, and that looks good actually for the headings, but for the text, the paragraphs, it's just kind of wanders down the left side, and it's just kind of the ragged edge on both sides. It just kind of looks messy, right? So a text align left is going to work a lot better because it creates that alignment. So there's a left alignment that says this is the same level of importance as this, and we just kind of follow it down the edge. Now, if you want to make it even more, I mean, this is risky, but you can also make it align on the left and the right side with the align justify. And if you do that, it looks pretty good. It's a nice column. But the weird thing about this is you get these inconsistent gaps between words, and I don't like the way that looks personally. So I prefer left align. And if you want, for this layout, if you have relatively short headings, maybe consider making the headings align center. Certainly images or captions for images you probably want to make center, but this I feel less confident about recommending. I think it's just something you can consider if you'd like. I still prefer left justify, I think. Maybe for the main title that could be in the center, but everything else can be on the left. Let's try this. Let me try it that way. I was just curious if that worked in that case. I'll just declare it. Oh, you know what? So I don't know if you can see what just happened here, but I declared the H1 text align left, but it did not apply that. It did not apply it because this rule, this declaration here, where I do the font family and everything, that one came after this one. And in CSS world, whatever you do most recently, the last thing you do has higher priority than anything before it. So that's how you would do that. Although that was the opposite of what I intended, so let me switch those again. Yeah, I'm still not a big fan of that, but that's the idea. So that's how you can play with those things. So again, that's alignment, using alignment. Use alignment to show order, to show that these are things that need to be read in this order going down, left, top to bottom. Okay, then repetition, that's a bit more abstract, but if you think about repetition, I'm repeating this same structure of, like if I have a step 2, I had a step 1. Like these are things, the word step is repeated here. The size of these headings is repeated. It's consistent each time. That's another kind of repetition. But basically doing the same thing twice, or doing repeating a design element multiple times in order to show that two things are of the same type. That's what repetition accomplishes. And then proximity. So this one's a little bit less clear, but you can understand that hopefully that this one I probably should tweak a bit. But if you we understand step 1 is this paragraph is about step 1 because they're next to each other, and this paragraph is about step 2 because they're next to each other. To improve the proximity, I think what I would probably do, what I will do actually, is change the padding after the amount of white space after the H3s to make them a little bit closer to the paragraph that comes after them. Let's say I use a half M unit. No, that's too much. Just say 0. I'll just delete all the padding after that. Oh no, yeah, so sorry, I was talking about padding, but I wrote margin. And somebody's having a hard time. I don't know what's going on out there. I don't know if you can hear the crying going on. So here I'm getting something a little confusing to me, so that's why I'm looking at this to figure out what I did wrong. If you look at, I've opened the inspector, the element inspector that lets me drill into each computed property of this. It looks like I did want margin bottom, but that didn't make the difference that I wanted it to, so let me see if I can figure out why. Oh, you know what it is? It's not the heading that I'm seeing the paragraph. The paragraph is adding the margin that's pushing the heading back up. So yeah, I could do, oh, this is kind of hacky, but I can make a negative margin so it'll override the one below it. I think this works. So yeah, there I go. Finally got these stuck together. I'm not totally thrilled with it, but it's okay. And it does demonstrate the purpose. Well, it sounds like I need to go. I'm not sure what's going on out there, but somebody's having a hard time. They may, and I've been going about an hour anyway, so I'm going to go see if I can help my son with whatever that is. So anyway, hopefully this was helpful. Again, hopefully you were able to take notes, and hopefully we'll be able to get back into cPanel. This is the last stream for this week, so basically you're on your own now to finish your own web layouts and designs and your digital methodology work. I'm happy to help you with that, but that's obviously kind of on your own, and so hopefully I can help you in a one-on-one conversation if necessary to help you figure out whatever problem you need to solve. Okay, well, thanks for watching. I'll upload this and archive it on YouTube for viewing later. Again, hopefully we'll be able to get to cPanel soon. Okay, bye. Thanks for watching.